The reading for this week is from Matthew and chapter 27 and verse 45 down to verse 50. So I will just read those few verses to you as we begin. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, darkness came over the whole land. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those who were standing there heard him say this, they said, "He is calling Elijah." Immediately, one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a stick, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. Alrighty, well, we're going to go on with our Lenten studies, and we're up to the fourth word from the cross, which is probably one of the most famous words which we've just looked at in the scriptures. Psalm 22. That's where we're going to go, but we're looking at the word from Matthew, where Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, this is a profound word, and something about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his resurrection is the paradox that surrounds it. Now, anything that's true is going to be paradoxical. And the bigger it is and the more important it is, the more paradoxical it will appear. Let me give you an example. The biggest ocean in the world is the Pacific Ocean. And if you were to be someone who's looking at the Pacific Ocean, say from the Bering Strait, right up between Alaska and Russia, you would say that the ocean was cold, it was grey and full of icebergs. But you could also be looking at the same ocean from the perspective of, say, Fiji, and you would say it's warm, it's turquoise blue, and it's full of reefs and beautiful bright coloured fish. And yet you'd still be talking about the same thing. So the bigger the thing is, and the more complex it is, the more paradoxical it can sometimes appear. And I believe that the biggest and most important thing we could ever look at is Jesus Christ crucified. And when we look at that, we see a paradox. Because on the one hand, we see the horror and the ghastliness of what took place in the torture of Jesus on that cross, and him bearing the sin of the world and overcoming death. But on the other hand, we have to see that is the means by which Jesus has entered the burning building of our sin and let himself be affected by the flames of our stupidity and of our evil. But he had to do that in order to rescue us. And so we have been rescued. There's one side of the paradox, but the other side of it is that it required this extraordinary descent into the brokenness of our humanity for that to take place. And so when we're looking at the word of Jesus from the cross, where he says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" we could easily just take that as one point of view and come up with all kinds of ideas about the nature of the atonement and who God really is, based just on that one small word. But we must understand the complexity of it and the profoundness of it if we're going to truly appreciate the meaning of it. And I believe that we need to understand that when Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" that he was quoting from a paradoxical psalm. And that psalm, of course, is Psalm 22. So Psalm 22 is the very same psalm where the crucifixion of Jesus was foreshadowed, and I believe prophetically put forward by King David. Now, King David experienced betrayal, he experienced suffering, and he experienced this paradox of God seemingly far away, and yet, nonetheless, he was always present. And so if we're going to look at this saying of Jesus, we must also look at what he was quoting when he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Because what he was quoting was the words of King David from Psalm 22. Let me just read to you some of the passages from Psalm 22, and you'll begin to get an inkling of what I'm talking about. I mean, the very obvious first verse is, and this is King David he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Clearly, Jesus is being foreshadowed in this psalm. And I believe that Jesus is actually deliberately saying those words because he's entering into the paradox that this psalm captures. So for King David, he's saying he feels like God's forsaken him. And many of David's psalms too, by the way, actually follow this paradoxical arc. It starts in one place, goes down into the valley, and then slowly comes up out the other side. So in this part, we're seeing him descend into despair, but in the second half of the psalm, we'll see him ascend into hope. And we must understand that curve to understand what Jesus is going through on the cross. So David begins with these words of dereliction, as they're often called. You know, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he goes on talking about how it seems like God has turned his ear away, that he's not listening to what he has to say. And then he goes on and he talks as if he was Jesus on the cross in one sense. And notice these words in verse 6 of Psalm 22. He says, but I am a worm, not a man, scorned by men and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. Now, these very same words are recorded in the Gospels about Jesus. They said that people shook their heads and they scorned him, they mocked him. So again, Psalm 22 was foreshadowing what Jesus would go through. And then it even says the very words that people said to Jesus on the cross in verse 8. It says, he trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. So people are not only mocking Jesus, but they're in a sense mocking God, the Father, by saying, well, if God it really sees this man, Jesus, as being who he says he is, the Messiah, then why doesn't God come and rescue him? But let's keep in mind, these are the words of David. Anyway, he goes on to say, a little bit further on, down in verse 12, many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me, roaring lions tearing their prey, open their mouths wide against me, and I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint, and my heart is turned to wax. Again, we know that when Jesus had the spear thrust into his side, that liquid that leaked out of his chest cavity was like molten wax. And then it goes on to say, the dogs have surrounded me, verse 16. And a band of evil men has encircled me, and they have pierced my hands and my feet. This is so incredibly specific to the very suffering that Jesus would go through. And yet David is saying figuratively, he feels like he has been crucified, so to speak, by his enemies. And yet, despite all of these terrible things that David's going through, as he goes through this descent in his psalm, we're going to see that in just a few short verses later, that it's going to turn the other way. In Psalm 22:22, David says, in spite of all this, in verse 22, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the congregation, I will praise you. In other words, I'm going to say that you are faithful, even though it appears that you're not, even though I'm going through a great deal of suffering at this time. Nonetheless, the day will come when I will declare your praise in the congregation. And wouldn't we all love to be able to do that right now? But, we'll have to do it online for now. Anyway, he goes on to say in verse 24, for he, that is God, has not despised or disdained the suffering of the afflicted one, and he has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. Now, I've heard some theologians say that when Jesus cried the prayer of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? That God the Father turned his face away from him, he couldn't even look upon him, and all kinds of extravagant ideas have been put forward, which I don't believe actually represent the nature of God as Father and Jesus as Son, and the connection which they have, which is an eternal connection. That's not saying that Jesus hasn't suffered. Yes, Jesus, like David, suffered. He went into the dark place. He went into the place where he felt like he was forsaken. But even David was able to say, I know that you will hear my cry for help and that you haven't abandoned me, even though it feels like it for now. If that's true for David, how much more true would it have to be for Jesus the Son? So can you see the paradox there? the paradox of suffering and yet connection. But it was the connection that Jesus had with the Father which enabled him to overcome the dereliction. Without the connection, Jesus would have simply given way to despair, and in giving way to despair would have proved himself to be no better than us. And he would have there was no way he could have been possibly resurrected. But Jesus had to face the test. He had to be proved to be who he was, to be the true Son of the Father, to be the first human being who's offered to God the Father a life of obedience. And I don't just mean ticking boxes of morality. I mean living a life that was full-hearted and strong and open to the Father, doing exactly as the Father commanded at every moment of his life with joy. And that is the thing. That is the very thing that enabled Jesus to take on the weight and the power and the pollution and the penalty of sin and to overcome it. If Jesus had given way to despair, all would have been lost. And so here's the paradox. Jesus was in the valley of death, of darkness, of despair. He had to face the temptation to give up the faith, to give up his connection to the Father. And he never did. He went through. And it actually goes on to say, just as David says here, for he has not despised nor disdained the suffering of his afflicted one. God the Father did not disdain his Son, nor did he turn his face away, as some theologians, I think, wrongly say. And he goes on to say that in the end, that everything will turn out for the best, and all that was lost in the moments of despair will be restored in the fullness of time. And of course, the full restoration that Jesus was able to secure, not only for himself, but on behalf of all humanity, was victory over death. And we'll talk more about that in the days to come. But just for now, let's see this extraordinary paradox in this saying of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? And Jesus had to endure that sensation, that had to walk into, if you like, he had to walk into the burning building of our sin. And in doing so, had to expose himself to the flames. And he himself was burnt by the flames, but he never gave way to despair. And he reached into the fire. He took a hold of us at great personal cost to himself and at great test to himself. And he has overcome the flames. He has overcome death, and he has rescued us. And that is good news. Amen.